The mop handle cracked against the marble floor when the cadet knocked it from his hands. "Pick that up, old man. You are disrupting my rehearsal." Earl Westbrook bent slowly, his right knee screaming the way it had screamed for 53 years, and retrieved the mop without a word. The ceremonial hall of Hollister Military Academy stretched around him like a cathedral, all dark wood and polished brass and portraits of generals who had never mopped a floor in their lives. Cadet Captain Bradley Thornton III stood at the center of the elevated stage, his uniform so crisp it looked like it had never been worn before today, his voice carrying to every corner of the room where 40 other cadets sat watching. What Thornton did not know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 47 hours he would be on his knees in this same hall, tears streaming down his face, begging forgiveness from a man whose call sign was still whispered with reverence in every Special Forces compound from Fort Bragg to Kandahar. Earl resumed mopping. His movements were slow but precise, the mop traveling in straight lines that would have satisfied any drill instructor who ever lived. He had learned to mop floors in basic training 60 years ago, and some lessons never left the body. The cadets in the gallery snickered. Someone in the third row made an exaggerated, limping motion that sent ripples of laughter through the group. Earl did not look up. He had stopped looking up at laughter a long time ago. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. And if stories about hidden heroes speak to you, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the quiet warriors among us. Now, let us continue. Thornton descended from the stage with the measured stride of a man who had practiced walking with authority in front of mirrors. His grandfather had been a 2-star general. His father had made 3 stars before retiring. Bradley Thornton III had grown up understanding that military excellence was inherited, that it ran in bloodlines like thoroughbred horses, and that the enlisted men who scrubbed toilets and pushed mops existed only to make officers look better by comparison. He stopped directly in front of Earl, close enough that Earl could smell the expensive cologne, the kind that came in bottles that cost more than Earl made in a week. "You are still here," Thornton said. "I gave instructions that all support staff were to be cleared from the hall during rehearsal." Earl's voice came out soft, roughened by decades of cigarettes he had quit 30 years ago, and screaming he had done in jungles that officially did not exist. "Yes, sir. My apologies, sir. I was told to ensure the hall was prepared for tomorrow." "Do I look like I care what you were told?" "No, sir." "Then why are you still talking?" Earl said nothing. His hands remained steady on the mop handle. Somewhere deep in his muscle memory, a different response wanted to surface, the response of a man who had once commanded respect in rooms far more dangerous than this one. But that man had died in a minefield 53 years ago. The man who remained was just a janitor with a limp and a mop and a silence that had become his only armor. Thornton turned to his audience, spreading his arms to include the watching cadets in what came next. "This," he announced, "is exactly what I was discussing in leadership seminar. The failure to maintain standards. Look at him. The uniform is 2 sizes too large. The shoes are falling apart. There's a smell coming off him that I can detect from here. And this is the face of Hollister Academy that we present to a 4-star general tomorrow." Several cadets laughed. A few looked uncomfortable but said nothing. In the back row, a young woman named Sarah Chun watched the old janitor's hands and noticed something strange. They were not shaking. A man being publicly humiliated should have trembling hands, should show some sign of the shame being heaped upon him. But the janitor's hands were steady as stone, gripping that mop handle with a precision that seemed wrong somehow, seemed trained. Thornton circled Earl slowly, performing for his audience. And the limp. My God, the limp. Every step is a production. Shuffle, shuffle, shuffle across the marble like a broken toy soldier. "Sir," Earl said quietly, "I can complete my work after your rehearsal if that would be more convenient." "More convenient." Thornton laughed, and the sound bounced off the vaulted ceiling. "The word convenient does not apply to people like you. You exist at our convenience. You work when we allow you to work. You breathe the same air as future officers of the United States military, because we permit it. Do you understand that? Yes, sir. The response was automatic. Muscle memory of a different kind. Earl had said yes, sir, to men who deserved it and men who did not, to commanders who led from the front and officers who hid behind desks, to screaming drill instructors and quiet legends who spoke once and changed the course of battles. He had said yes, sir, in jungles and deserts and mountains and places that appeared on no map. The words meant nothing anymore. They were just sounds that kept things moving, that prevented escalation, that allowed an old man with a destroyed knee to finish his shift and go home to an empty apartment. Thornton leaned close. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried even further than his shouts. I know your type. Probably never served a day in your life. Probably tell people you were in Vietnam just to get sympathy at the VFW. Pathetic old men making up war stories because their real lives were too boring to mention. Well, let me tell you something, old-timer. I come from a family of real warriors. My grandfather took a bullet at Incheon. My father commanded a battalion in Desert Storm. And I will not have some shuffling fraud contaminating the hall where a 4-star general will be honoring our legacy tomorrow. Earl looked up for the first time. His eyes met Thornton's, and for just a moment, something shifted in his face. The cadets who were watching would later struggle to describe it. The janitor did not move, did not speak, did not change his posture in any visible way. But something behind his eyes went cold and still, like the surface of a lake freezing over in an instant. Then it was gone, and he was just an old man with a mop again. I will finish quickly, sir, Earl said. You will not know I am here. Thornton held his gaze for a long moment, then snorted and turned back toward the stage. See that I do not, he called over his shoulder. And do something about that, Limp. You are embarrassing yourself. The rehearsal resumed. Earl returned to his mopping, moving along the edges of the hall where the shadows gathered and janitors belonged. Sarah Chan watched him go and felt something tighten in her chest, a wrongness she could not name. Near the main entrance, Sergeant Major Rita Delgado stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set like concrete. She had been watching the entire exchange. Her eyes followed the old janitor as he worked, tracking the precise movements, the unconscious way he checked corners before entering new sections of the hall, the military bearing that 11 years of pushing a mop had not erased. She knew. She had suspected for years, had caught glimpses in the old records before the fire destroyed them. A call sign, a minefield, 7 men carried to safety. She had never asked because some men earned their silence. But watching Thornton's performance, watching the cruelty dressed up as leadership, she wondered if silence had stopped being a kindness and become something else entirely. Earl finished his work as the evening light faded from the high windows. He stored his supplies in the maintenance closet and signed out at the security desk and walked a shuffling walk toward the north wing of the academy. The memorial wall rose before him in the half-darkness, black granite etched with gold names. Men and women who had given everything in service to something larger than themselves. He stopped at a bare section of stone, unmarked and unremarkable, and pressed his palm flat against the cold surface. Teddy, he whispered, the general is coming tomorrow. Your boy. He made it. 4 stars. You will be so proud. His voice cracked on the last word. 53 years of carrying a promise, and he still could not speak the name without breaking. The apartment was 14 feet by 12 feet and contained everything Earl Westbrook owned in the world. A single bed with military corners that had not varied by a centimeter in 11 years. A small refrigerator that hummed in the darkness like a mechanical heartbeat. A wooden chair and a table scarred by decades of use. On the table sat a leather wallet worn soft by 53 years of handling. And inside that wallet lived the ghost that Earl carried everywhere he went. He sat in the chair at 4 in the morning because sleep had become a stranger decades ago. The nightmares did not come as often anymore, but their absence was almost worse. At least when Teddy visited him in dreams, Earl could see his face. Now there were just empty hours before dawn, hours filled with silence and the weight of promises kept and letters never delivered. His fingers found the wallet without conscious thought. The leather had molded itself to his touch over the years, knew the shape of his hands the way a weapon knows its wielder. He opened it slowly, carefully, as if the contents might crumble to dust if handled wrong. The photograph came first. 8 faces arranged in 2 rows. Young men with eyes that had not yet seen what they would see, smiles that did not know they were temporary. Earl traced each face with a fingertip. Morrison, dead in the 3rd week. Kowalski, dead in the 5th. Hernandez, made it home, but put a bullet in his brain 6 months later. The faces blurred as his finger moved across them, not from tears, but from a sheer repetition of the ritual, the same touching in the same order every single morning for 53 years. Teddy Vance stood in the back row, second from the left. 19 years old with a jaw that would have squared out with age and eyes that crinkled when he laughed. He laughed often. He wrote letters to his pregnant wife every night by flashlight, describing the baby's future with a certainty that seemed impossible in a jungle where futures were measured in hours. He called Earl Sergeant and followed every order without hesitation and stepped onto a mine because Earl had paused 1 second too long, deciding which direction to send him. The letter came out next. The envelope had yellowed with age, the edges soft as cloth from handling, but the seal remained intact. Earl had never opened it. The letter was not for him. The letter was for a baby who had never been born when Teddy wrote it, a son who was now a 4-star general flying in a Hollister Academy, in less than 40 hours to attend a ceremony that Earl would watch from the shadows like he watched everything else. Dear son, the envelope read in Teddy's careful handwriting, for when you are old enough to understand. Earl pressed the envelope to his chest and closed his eyes. The words he wanted to say caught in his throat the way they always caught, trapped behind 53 years of guilt that had calcite into something harder than bone. I should have been faster, he whispered to the empty room. I should have sent you left instead of right. I should have taken point myself that morning instead of letting you volunteer. I should have done 100 things differently, Teddy, and you would be here reading this letter to your grandchildren instead of me sitting alone in the dark holding it like a coward. The dog tags came out last. 2 sets, worn on the same chain. 1 set bore Earl's information, the letters and numbers nearly illegible from decades of wear. The other set was pristine by comparison, protected by a small plastic sleeve that Earl had fashioned from a sandwich bag in 1971 and replaced every few years with religious devotion. Theodore James Vance. O positive. Catholic. The tags had been around Teddy's neck when he died. Earl had removed them in the helicopter, had held them in his bloody fist while the medics worked and failed and finally stopped, had carried them every day since as a reminder that some debts could never be repaid. The morning routine continued. Earl showered in water that never got fully hot, dressed in the same faded blue maintenance uniform he had worn for 11 years, laced the orthopedic shoes that were 3 months past needing replacement. He made instant coffee and drank it standing at the window, watching the sky lighten over the academy campus in the distance. The ceremonial hall was visible from here, a dark shape against the dawn, and somewhere inside that building Cadet Captain Bradley Thornton III was probably sleeping the sleep of the righteous, dreaming of the 4-star general who would shake his hand tomorrow and validate every assumption he had ever made about bloodlines and destiny. Earl knew about General Theodore Vance, Jr. He had followed the career from a distance, tracking promotions through newspapers and later through the internet at the public library. Lieutenant, Captain, Major, Light Colonel, Full Bird Colonel, Brigadier General, 2 stars, 3 stars, 4 stars. Each promotion had felt like a message from Teddy, a confirmation that the promise Earl made in that helicopter had not been entirely broken. Watch over him, Teddy had said. His hand had been slippery with blood, his grip weakening with every word. Tell him I would have been there. Tell him I wanted to be there. Earl had never told him anything. He had never delivered the letter. He had never contacted the widow who became a single mother, who became a grandmother, who died 6 years ago without ever knowing what happened to her husband beyond the official notification of death in service. Earl had watched from the margins of their lives like a ghost, present but invisible, carrying Teddy's last words in his pocket, while the son grew up fatherless and the wife grew old waiting for answers that never came. The guilt was not rational. Earl knew this. Therapists at the VA had explained it in clinical terms: survivor's guilt, the irrational belief that living was a betrayal of the dead. But the therapists had not been in that minefield. They had not heard the click of the tripwire. They had not watched Teddy's body lift into the air and come apart and somehow still be breathing when Earl reached him. They had not made the calculation in a fraction of a second, the decision to carry the wounded out one at a time through 200 meters of death, stepping only in his own footprints because there was no other way to know where the mines were not. 7 trips. 7 men saved. Earl's knee had shattered on the 7th trip, shrapnel tearing through the joint, but he had kept crawling because Teddy was still out there, still breathing, still waiting. The 8th trip had nearly killed him. He had dragged himself and Teddy those last 50 meters on his belly, his ruined leg leaving a trail of blood in the mud, Teddy's arms wrapped around his neck like a child being carried to bed. The helicopter had been waiting. The medics had been ready. And none of it had mattered because some wounds were too deep and some blood loss was too much, and some promises were made to dying men who did not have enough time left to hear them kept. Earl finished his coffee and rinsed the cup and placed it in the exact spot it had occupied for 11 years. He collected his wallet and tucked it into his breast pocket, feeling the weight of the photograph and the dog tags and the letter that had never been opened. Then he walked out into the morning, his right leg dragging slightly with each step, his shadow stretching long across the pavement as the sun rose over Hollister Military Academy. The general was coming. Didier Son, the baby who had become a man, who had become a legend in his own right. Earl had spent 53 years avoiding this moment, hiding in plain sight, letting anonymity become a kind of penance. But now the moment was coming to him, whether he wanted it or not, and he did not know if he had the strength to face it or the courage to keep running. His hand touched his breast pocket, feeling the envelope through the fabric. For when you are old enough to understand. Teddy's son was 53 years old now, a 4-star general, a leader of men, surely old enough to understand. But understanding required delivery, and delivery required Earl to look into those eyes that looked so much like Teddy's and confess that he had let a father die because he hesitated for 1 second on a February morning in a jungle that no longer existed. He was not sure he would ever be strong enough for that. The ceremonial hall buzzed with controlled chaos when Earl arrived for his morning shift. Cadets moved furniture according to diagrams that changed every 15 minutes. Maintenance staff polished brass that was already gleaming. Colonel Marcus Webb stood near the main entrance barking orders into a phone while simultaneously directing traffic with his free hand. A 4-star general was coming, and Hollister Academy intended to shine like it had never shone before. Earl collected his supplies from the maintenance closet and began his work along the periphery of the hall, staying close to the walls where janitors belonged. His mop moved in the same precise lines it had moved for 11 years, methodical and invisible, exactly how he preferred it. But today the invisibility felt different. Today it felt like armor he was not sure would hold. Thornton's voice cut through the noise before Earl saw him. The cadet captain stood on the elevated stage, directing a group of underclassmen in the arrangement of chairs for the VIP section. His commands were sharp and theatrical, designed to be heard by everyone in the hall, designed to demonstrate the kind of leadership that Thornton believed resided in volume rather than substance. "No, no, no," Thornton shouted at a young cadet struggling with a heavy chair. "Are you deliberately incompetent, or does it come naturally? The VIP section faces east." "East? Do you need me to draw you a compass?" The young cadet flushed red and repositioned the chair. Thornton watched with his arms crossed, shaking his head slowly, performing disappointment for his audience. Then his eyes found Earl working near the south wall, and something shifted in his expression. The disappointment became something sharper, something hungry. "Well, well," Thornton announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "Our resident cripple has returned. I thought perhaps yesterday's lesson might have inspired you to call in sick today." Spare us all the spectacle of watching you drag that leg around like a broken shopping cart." Several cadets laughed. Others looked away. Earl continued mopping without response, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands steady on the handle. Thornton descended from the stage and crossed the hall with purposeful strides, his boots clicking against the marble that Earl had polished to a mirror shine. "I asked the commandant about you this morning," Thornton said, stopping close enough that Earl could see his reflection in the cadet's polished belt buckle. 11 years you have worked here. 11 years of shuffling around this institution like a ghost. No family listed on your emergency contacts. No military service in your personnel file. Just a sad old man with a limp and a mop and nothing else to show for 74 years of taking up space on this planet. Earl said nothing. His mop continued its path across the marble. "The commandant said you were a reliable worker," Thornton continued. Reliable. The highest praise he could muster. Not exceptional. Not valuable. Reliable. Like a toilet that flushes consistently. Like a light switch that does not spark. You have spent 11 years being compared to functional plumbing, old man. Does that not bother you? "No, sir," Earl said quietly. "No, sir." Thornton laughed and turned to include the watching cadets in his performance. Listen to him. "No, sir." Like a trained dog. Like a machine programmed to accept whatever scraps fall from the table. This is what happens when men have no pride. This is what happens when mediocrity becomes a lifestyle. You end up 74 years old, mopping floors for minimum wage, saying no sir to boys young enough to be your grandchildren. Sarah Chun stood near the east entrance, her hands clenched at her sides. She had watched the exchange from the beginning, had felt the wrongness growing in her chest with every word Thornton spoke. Something about the old janitor's stillness bothered her. It was not the stillness of defeat. It was the stillness of something waiting. She had seen that kind of stillness before in documentaries about predators and footage of soldiers before combat. The old man was not broken. He was containing something. Thornton circled Earl slowly, examining him like a specimen. "The limp," he mused. "I've been thinking about that limp. What is the story there? Workplace accident? Drunk driving? Or did you just wake up one morning and decide that walking properly required too much effort?" Earl's response came soft as a whisper. "Old injury, sir. Old injury." Thornton's eyebrows rose. "From what? Falling off a bar stool? Tripping over your own incompetence?" "From service, sir." The words hung in the air. Thornton's expression flickered, then hardened into something uglier than before. "Service, right? Let me guess. You spent 2 years filing papers at some stateside depot, and now you tell everyone you were in Vietnam. I have met 100 men like you. Stolen valor wrapped in self-pity. It is pathetic." Earl looked up. His eyes met Thornton's, and again Sarah Chun saw that shift, that freezing over, that instant transformation from tired old man to something else entirely. But this time it lasted longer. This time Thornton saw it too, and for just a moment, the cadet captain took half a step backward before catching himself. "I do not tell anyone anything, sir," Earl said. His voice had not changed in volume, but something in its quality had shifted. There was weight there now. Density. The voice of a man who had given orders in places where orders meant the difference between living and dying. "I just do my job." Thornton recovered his composure with visible effort. His face reddened. His hands clenched at his sides. The brief moment of uncertainty transformed into fury at having shown weakness in front of his audience. "You do your job," he repeated. "Then do it somewhere else. I want this section of floor mopped again. Then I want the section by the stage mopped. Then I want you to mop the entrance 3 times until I can see my reflection in it. And if I see you resting, if I see you so much as pause to catch your breath, I will have you written up for insubordination. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." Earl moved to comply. His leg dragged across the marble as he carried his mop and bucket toward the section Thornton had indicated. The cadets watched him go, some with amusement, some with discomfort, one with growing certainty that something was very wrong with this picture. Sergeant Major Rita Delgado appeared at Sarah Chen's elbow. The senior enlisted advisor had entered through a side door, her eyes tracking the confrontation with an expression that mixed anger with something else. Something that looked almost like grief. "Ma'am," Chin said quietly. "Should someone intervene?" Delgado did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on Earl as he resumed his mopping, his movements steady and precise despite the obvious pain in his knee. She watched the way he positioned his body when he worked, the unconscious economy of motion, the way his head turned slightly every time a door opened somewhere in the hall. "I have been watching that man for 11 years, Delgado said finally. Her voice was barely audible. Watching him check corners like he is clearing rooms. Watching him maintain that military bearing no matter how tired he gets. Watching him stand at the memorial wall every single night, touching a section of blank stone like there's a name there only he can see." Chun frowned. "Mung?" Delgado turned to look at her. "Before the records fire in 2019, I had access to some old classified files. Operations that never officially happened. Men who never officially served. There was a call sign that kept appearing in the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. Shepard. They said he never lost a man under his direct command. They said he would walk through hell itself to bring his people home." Chun looked back at the old janitor mopping floors on his ruined knee. "You think he is a shepherd?" Delgado shook her head slowly. "I do not think anything. I know better than to make assumptions about things I cannot prove. But I will tell you this, Cadet Chin. If that man is who I suspect he might be, then what we just witnessed was not a captain disciplining a janitor. It was a boy playing soldier, trying to humiliate a legend. And legends have a way of revealing themselves when pushed too far." Across the hall, Thornton had returned to the stage, his voice rising again as he found new targets for his authority. Earl continued mopping in silence, his face betraying nothing, his hands steady as stone. But something had changed. Something in the air. Something in the way certain eyes followed the old janitor as he worked. The general would arrive in less than 36 hours. And the walls of Hollister Academy were about to learn that some secrets refused to stay buried forever. The smell hit him first. Floor polish and industrial cleaner mixing in the afternoon heat, and suddenly Earl was not in the ceremonial hall anymore. He was 7,000 miles away and 53 years in the past, and the smell was not floor polish at all. It was defoliant and burning vegetation and the copper tang of blood that never really washed out of memory, no matter how many years passed. February 1971. Guanti, Hovin. The jungle pressed in from all sides like a living thing trying to swallow them whole. 8 men moving single file through vegetation so thick that the man in front disappeared after 10 feet. Earl walked third in the formation, close enough to hear Teddy Vance humming under his breath the way he always hummed when he was nervous. Some song his wife loved. Something about coming home. The intelligence briefing had been clear. This corridor was swept. No enemy activity for 6 weeks. Safe passage to the extraction point 12 clicks north. Earl had questioned the assessment, had pushed back against the lieutenant who delivered it, had argued that nothing in this war was ever truly swept or truly safe. But orders were orders, and the mission required speed over caution, and so they moved through the corridor that intelligence promised was clean. Teddy stopped humming. Earl noticed the silence before he noticed anything else. In the jungle, silence was never good. Silence meant something had changed. Silence meant the birds knew something the men did not. "Sarge." Teddy's voice came back low and tight. "I got a bad feeling." Earl moved up the line, his boots silent on the jungle floor despite the vegetation. Teddy stood frozen at a small clearing, maybe 20 meters across, carpeted with undergrowth that looked exactly like every other patch of undergrowth they had crossed that morning. But Teddy was not moving. His eyes were fixed on something in the dirt that Earl could not see from his position. "What do you got?" "I do not know." Teddy's voice cracked slightly. "Something is wrong. The ground looks different here. Softer maybe. I cannot explain it." Earl studied the clearing. The undergrowth was uniform. Too uniform. Nature did not work in perfect patterns. Nature was chaos and randomness and competition for sunlight. But this clearing looked almost landscaped, almost intentional, and that meant only one thing. Minefield. Earl breathed the word. Everyone hold position. Nobody moves. The squad froze. 8 men suddenly aware that they were standing in the middle of a killing field with no way of knowing which step would be their last. Earl's mind raced through the options. They could not go back. The trail behind them was just as likely to be mined as the ground ahead. They could not stay. Charlie knew these fields, probably had spotters waiting for the Americans to bunch up, so a single mortar round could finish what the mine started. Earl made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He would go first, step by step, testing every inch of ground, creating a safe path that the others could follow exactly in his footprints. It would take hours. It would require concentration that left no room for fear. But it was the only way. "I'm going to walk us out," he told his men. "Single file. Step exactly where I step. Not close to where I step. Exactly. If I make it across, the path is clear. Follow my prints and nothing else." "Sarge," Morrison whispered, "that is 200 meters of hell. Then I will see you on the other side of hell, Morrison." Earl took the first step. Nothing. Second step. Nothing. Third step. His boot came down on something that shifted slightly under his weight, and his heart stopped, but there was no click, no explosion, just a root that had rotted soft in the wet season. He kept moving. Fourth step. Fifth. Sixth. The clearing stretched ahead of him like an ocean, and he was walking on water, testing every ripple, praying that faith would be enough to keep him from sinking. He was halfway across when Teddy called out behind him. "Sarge, the lieutenant is saying we need to move faster. He is ordering us to spread out and cross together." Earl did not turn around. He had not stopped moving. "Tell the lieutenant that if he gives that order, I will shoot him myself. Single file. My footprints. No exceptions." Teddy relayed the message. The lieutenant did not argue. Even officers learned to listen when sergeants spoke in that particular tone. Earl reached the far side of the clearing and allowed himself one breath of relief before turning to guide his men across. Morrison came first, stepping carefully in Earl's boot prints, his face pale but focused. Then Kowalski, then Hernandez, then the others, one by one. A slow procession of terrified men trusting their lives to the footprints of their sergeant. Teddy came last. He was 10 meters from safety when it happened. Earl would replay the moment 1,000 times in the decades that followed, searching for the mistake, analyzing every variable. Teddy had been stepping carefully, precisely, following the path exactly as instructed. But something made him hesitate. A sound in the jungle, a shadow that moved, something that pulled his attention sideways for just a fraction of a second, and his foot came down 2 inches to the left of where it should have been. The click was the loudest sound Earl had ever heard. Teddy's eyes met his across those final 10 meters. There was no fear in them, just surprise, just a quiet, "oh," that never made it past his lips before the world turned white and red and the jungle filled with screaming. The mine was a bouncing Betty, designed to launch into the air before detonating at chest height. But it was old, waterlogged, and it fired low instead of high. The shrapnel tore through Teddy's legs and abdomen instead of his chest. It meant he did not die instantly. It meant Earl had to watch him fall and hear him screaming and know that this was his fault because he had hesitated for 1 second before sending Teddy down that path instead of going himself. Earl ran. He did not think about the minefield or the other potential threats or the lieutenant's screaming orders that no longer mattered. He ran to Teddy and dropped to his knees in the blood-soaked dirt and pressed his hands against wounds that were never going to stop bleeding no matter how much pressure he applied. "Sarge!" Teddy's voice was wet and broken. "Sarge, I cannot feel my legs." "You're going to be fine." Earl heard himself lying. "Extraction is coming. You're going to be fine." The letter. Teddy's hand found Earl's wrist, gripping with strength that should not have been possible. "My pocket. The letter for my son. You have to give it to him. Promise me." "I promise." "Tell him I wanted to be there." Teddy's eyes were losing focus. "Tell him I would have been there. Tell him his daddy loved him before he was even born." "I will tell him." Earl's vision blurred. "I swear I will tell him." "And Sarge?" Teddy's grip weakened. "It was not your fault. You hear me? Whatever you are thinking right now, stop. It was not your fault. Those are the last coherent words Theodore James Vance ever spoke. He died 47 minutes later in the extraction helicopter, his hand wrapped around Earl's, his blood soaking through Earl's uniform, his final breath escaping in a whisper that might have been his wife's name or might have been nothing at all. The mop clattered to the floor. Earl blinked, and he was back in the ceremonial hall, back in his faded blue uniform, back in the body of a 74-year-old janitor with a ruined knee and a letter that had never been delivered. His hand was shaking for the first time in years. His face was wet. A young cadet stood a few feet away, frozen in the act of walking past. Sarah Chun. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Earl's face with an expression that mixed confusion with something that looked almost like recognition. "Sir," she said softly, "are you all right?" Earl bent slowly to retrieve his mop. His knee screamed. His heart screamed louder. "Fine," he managed. "Just fine. Old memories. They sneak up on you sometimes." He resumed mopping. His hands steadied. His face dried. But somewhere deep inside, in the place where he kept Teddy's last words locked away, something had cracked open that could not be closed again. "Still here, Teddy," he whispered to the marble floor. "Still trying to keep that promise." The maintenance break room smelled like burnt coffee and resignation. Earl sat alone at the small table in the corner, his hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. His knee throbbed with the particular intensity that meant rain was coming, or that he had pushed too hard, or that 53 years of damage did not care about weather patterns and simply hurt whenever it wanted to hurt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A water stain on the ceiling tile looked almost like a map of a country that no longer existed. The door opened without knocking. Sergeant Major Rita Delgado stepped inside and closed it behind her with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 28 years learning when doors needed to be closed. She did not ask permission to sit. She simply pulled out the chair across from Earl and lowered herself into it, her eyes never leaving his face. They sat in silence for a long moment. Earl did not look up from his coffee. Delgado did not look away from Earl. The fluorescent lights continued their buzzing, indifferent to the weight of what was about to be said. "I am not here to save you," Delgado said finally. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, stripped of the military formality she wore like a second uniform. "I am not here to file complaints or launch investigations or do any of the things that regulations say I should do after watching what Thornton has been doing to you." Earl's hands tightened slightly around his cup. "Then why are you here?" "Because I know who you are." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Earl's face did not change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that Delgado recognized immediately. She had seen that posture before. She had studied it in photographs. She had read about it in classified files that were supposed to have been destroyed. "You do not know anything," Earl said quietly. Delgado reached into her pocket and produced a small photograph, creased and faded, clearly copied from an official source. She placed it on the table between them. 8 men in jungle fatigues, arranged in 2 rows, their faces young and hard, and full of the particular confidence that came from surviving things that should have killed them. Earl's eyes dropped to the photograph. His breath caught. "Operation Prairie Fire," Delgado said. February 1971. Classified so deep that the records were supposed to be destroyed after the war ended. But records have a way of surviving, Mr. Westbrook. Or should I say Master Sergeant Westbrook? Earl said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph, on the faces of men who had trusted him, on the face of a 19-year-old private who would be dead within a week of that picture being taken. "I found this in 2018, Delgado continued, a year before the records fire. I was researching something else entirely, stumbled across a reference to a call sign that kept appearing in the most dangerous operations of the entire war. Shepard. They said he never lost a man under his direct command. They said he carried 7 wounded soldiers through a minefield one at a time, stepping only in his own footprints, destroying his knee in the process. They said he received the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony that never officially happened for actions that were never officially recorded." Earl's voice came out hoarse. "That was a long time ago. 53 years. Delgado nodded. A long time to carry something alone. A long time to let boys like Thornton mock you for a limp you earned saving lives. A long time to stand at that memorial wall every night touching blank stone because the names of your brothers were never allowed to be carved there. Earl looked up. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. Why are you telling me this? Because General Theodore Vance Jr. lands in less than 30 hours. Delgado leaned forward, her voice dropping. And I know why he requested this visit. I know what he has been searching for his entire career. I know that his father was Private First Class Theodore James Vance, one of the 7 men you carried out of that minefield. I know that his father died in the extraction helicopter. And I know that you have been running from that ghost for 53 years. Earl's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the pocket where Teddy's dog tags lay hidden beneath the fabric of his uniform. You cannot prove any of this. I do not need to prove it. Delgado sat back. I am not here to expose you, Mr. Westbrook. I am here to tell you that you have a choice. You can keep hiding. You can let Thornton humiliate you for another 30 hours and then watch the general's ceremony from the shadows like you watch everything else. You can die with that letter still undelivered and that promise still unkept. Earl flinched. The letter. She knew about the letter. Or, Delgado continued, you can let the truth come out. Not for recognition, not for vindication, but because there is a man flying into this academy who has spent his entire life wondering what happened to his father, wondering if anyone remembers, wondering if anyone still cares. And you're the only person left alive who can answer those questions. The break room fell silent again. Earl stared at the photograph on the table, at Teddy's face frozen in a moment before everything changed. He thought about the letter in his pocket, the words that had waited 53 years to be read. He thought about the promise he had made in a blood-soaked helicopter while a young man died in his arms. I cannot, he said finally. His voice cracked on the word. You do not understand. It was my fault. I hesitated. 1 second. 1 second of hesitation, and Teddy stepped on that mine instead of me. His son deserves to know what happened, but he does not deserve to know it from a man who killed his father. Delgado reached across the table and placed her hand over Earl's. The gesture was unexpected, intimate in a way that military protocol did not allow, and Earl found himself unable to pull away. I have read the after-action reports, she said softly. All of them. The ones that survived anyway. Every man in your squad credited you with saving their lives. Every single one. They said you walked through hell to bring them home. They said you crawled the last 50 meters on your belly with your knee destroyed and a dying man on your back, because leaving him behind was not something you knew how to do. They were wrong, Earl whispered. Teddy died. Teddy died because war is random and cruel, and sometimes the best men fall no matter how hard we fight to save them. Delgado squeezed his hand. But 7 men lived because you refused to let them die. 7 families got their sons back. 7 futures were possible because a sergeant called Shepard decided that his own footprints were the only safe path through a minefield and then walked that path 8 times. Earl closed his eyes. The weight of 53 years pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than any rucksack he had ever carried, heavier than Teddy's body on that final crawl through the mud. I do not know if I can do this, he said. Delgado released his hand and stood. You have 30 hours to decide. The general lands tomorrow afternoon. The ceremony is tomorrow evening. Whatever you choose, I will respect it. But I want you to know something, Master Sergeant. Earl looked up. If I had served under you, I would have followed you anywhere. And I think Private Vance felt the same way. I think that is why he stepped forward on that path when you hesitated. Not because you made a mistake, but because he trusted you enough to go first. She left the photograph on the table and walked out without another word. Earl sat alone in the buzzing fluorescent light, staring at the faces of his ghosts, feeling the weight of a letter that had waited 53 years to be delivered. Tomorrow. Teddy's son would be here tomorrow, and Earl had 30 hours to decide if he was finally ready to come home. The call came at 6 in the morning. General Vance's plane had departed 4 hours ahead of schedule. Weather window. Operational necessity. The kind of explanation that made perfect sense on paper and, through carefully orchestrated ceremonies, into chaos. Colonel Webb received the news while still in his bathrobe and immediately began making phone calls that woke half the academy staff from sleep they desperately needed. Earl heard about the change from a maintenance supervisor who burst into the supply closet where he was restocking cleaning materials. "The general lands in 2 hours," the supervisor said, his voice pitched high with panic. "All hands to the ceremonial hall. Full preparation protocol. Move, move, move." The hall transformed into a hive of controlled panic. Cadets who should have been in morning classes were pressed into service polishing already polished brass. Maintenance staff who had finished their work the night before found themselves doing it again, while officers watched with clipboards and frowns. Thornton stood at the center of it all, his voice rising above the chaos, his commands growing sharper as the pressure mounted. Earl worked near the main entrance, buffing a section of floor that had been buffed 3 times already. His knee screamed with every movement, but he did not slow down. He could not slow down. Somewhere above this academy, cutting through clouds at 600 miles per hour, Teddy's sun was descending toward a truth that had waited 53 years to be spoken. The general's motorcade arrived at 9:47 in the morning. Earl knew because he was standing near a window when the black SUVs turned through the main gate, their flags snapping in the wind, their windows tinted dark against the morning sun. His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the pocket where Teddy's dog tags lay hidden. His heart hammered against his ribs. Colonel Webb met the motorcade at the front steps. Through the window, Earl watched the formalities unfold. Salutes exchanged, hands shaken, words spoken that he could not hear but could easily imagine. "Welcome to Hollister Academy, General. We are honored by your presence, General. Everything is prepared for this evening's ceremony, General." Then the rear door of the lead SUV opened, and Theodore Vance Jr. stepped out into the morning light. Earl's breath stopped. 53 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition so sharp it nearly drove him to his knees. The jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the particular tilt of his head when he listened to someone speak. Teddy. It was Teddy, age past the 19 years he had been allowed to live, wearing 4 stars instead of a private single stripe, carrying himself with the authority of a man who had spent his life becoming what his father had dreamed of becoming. Earl turned away from the window. His hands were shaking. His vision blurred at the edges. He grabbed his mop and retreated deeper into the hall, away from the entrance, away from the man whose face would haunt him more completely than any ghost ever had. The tour began almost immediately. Colonel Webb led the general through the academy's public spaces, narrating history and tradition and the proud legacy of officers who had graduated from these halls. Earl tracked their progress through the building by the sounds of footsteps and voices, always staying one corridor ahead, always finding another shadow to disappear into. But Hollister Academy was not large enough for hiding. Not today. The tour route changed without warning. Something about the general wanting to see the maintenance facilities, wanting to understand how the academy operated at every level. Earl heard the footsteps approaching and looked desperately for an exit, but there was only the supply closet behind him and the corridor ahead, and the corridor was already filling with uniforms. He pressed himself against the wall, mop in hand, head down, invisible in the way that janitors were always invisible. The entourage passed within 10 feet of him. Colonel Webb's voice washed over him like noise. Staff officers murmured responses. And then, for just a moment, the general paused. Earl did not look up. He could not look up, but he felt the weight of attention, the particular pressure of being observed by someone whose observation mattered. The general had stopped walking. The general was looking at something. The general was looking at him. "The limp," a staff officer said. "Excuse me, sir?" General Vance's voice was quiet, thoughtful, nothing like the command voice Earl had expected. "That man, the janitor. I noticed he was limping when we passed him near the entrance." Pronounced limp. Right leg. Looks like an old injury. Colonel Webb cleared his throat. "That would be Mr. Westbrook, sir. He has worked here for 11 years. Reliable employee. Keeps to himself." The general did not respond immediately. Earl could feel the gaze pressing against him, examining, analyzing, searching for something that might or might not be there. His hand tightened on the mop handle. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone in the corridor could hear it. "Carry on," the general said finally. The footsteps resumed. The entourage moved past. Earl remained pressed against the wall, breathing in shallow gasps, waiting for the corridor to empty. He looked up just as the general turned a corner at the far end of the hall. For one fraction of a second, their eyes met. The general's stride faltered. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, to the place where his father's dog tags hung beneath his uniform. Then the corner swallowed him, and he was gone. Earl slumped against the wall. His legs threatened to give out. His mind raced through the implications of that momentary eye contact, that brief falter in the general's stride. Had he seen something? Had he recognized something? Or was Earl simply projecting his own terror onto a stranger's passing glance? The sound of boots on marble announced Thornton's arrival before his voice did. "There you are." The cadet captain rounded the corner with fury written across his face. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The general requested an inspection of the maintenance facilities. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Earl straightened slowly. "No, sir. It means that in approximately 2 hours, a 4-star general is going to walk through the spaces where you work. It means that everything needs to be perfect. It means that you need to be invisible, more invisible than you have ever been in your pathetic life. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Thornton stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I saw the way he looked at you." The general. He stopped and stared at you like you were something worth looking at. "I do not know what that was about, and I do not care. But if you do anything at all, to embarrass this academy during the general's visit, I will personally ensure that you never work anywhere in this state again. Are we clear?" Earl met Thornton's eyes. For just a moment, he considered telling the truth. Considered watching this arrogant boy's face crumble as he realized who he had been mocking for 2 days. Considered the satisfaction of vindication after 53 years of silence. But the moment passed. The truth was not his to tell. Not yet. Not like this. "Yes, sir," Earl said. "Perfectly clear." Thornton held his gaze for a long moment, searching for defiance, finding nothing but the tired compliance of an old man with a mop. He snorted and turned away, his boots clicking against the marble as he disappeared down the corridor. Earl stood alone in the empty hallway, his hand pressed against his chest, feeling the weight of Teddy's dog tags through the fabric of his uniform. The general had seen him. The general had noticed his limp. The general had touched his own chest in the exact spot where dog tags would hang. 24 hours. The ceremony was in 24 hours. And somehow, in that brief moment of eye contact, Earl had felt the walls he had built over 53 years begin to crack. The night shift was supposed to be quiet. Earl had requested it specifically, knowing that the ceremony preparations would keep the day staff running until exhaustion claimed them, knowing that darkness would give him space to think. But thinking was proving to be more dangerous than he had anticipated. Thinking meant remembering. Remembering meant feeling. And feeling meant confronting a choice he had spent 53 years avoiding. He stood at the memorial wall in the north wing, his palm pressed flat against the cold granite, his eyes fixed on the blank section of stone where Teddy's name should have been carved. The classified designation had kept his death off every official memorial. No wall in Washington bore his name. No plaque in his hometown marked his sacrifice. Only Earl remembered. Only Earl stood vigil. "I could leave," Earl whispered to the stone. "Right now. Walk out the service entrance. Disappear before dawn. I have done it before. Done it so many times I have lost count. Every time someone got too close to the truth, every time recognition flickered in someone's eyes, I ran. I'm good at running, Teddy. 53 years of practice." The stone offered no response. It never did. But Earl kept talking anyway, the way he had talked to Teddy every night for 11 years, the way he had talked to him in shelters and under bridges and in the back of churches where homeless men were allowed to sleep if they stayed quiet. "Your boy is here." Earl's voice cracked. "He has your jaw, your shoulders, that way you tilted your head when you were listening. He is everything you wanted to be, Teddy. 4 stars. Commands respect just by walking into a room. You will be so proud of him. So damn proud." His hand trembled against the granite. The letter in his pocket felt heavier than it had ever felt, weighted with decades of undelivered words. He is looking for me. Earl closed his eyes. Not me specifically. He does not know my name. But he is looking for Shepard. Looking for answers about what happened to you. Looking for someone who remembers. And I am standing 30 feet from him, polishing floors, saying yes, sir, to children who mock me for the knee I destroyed carrying you home. I could end his search tonight. I could walk through his quarters right now and knock on the door and hand him this letter and tell him everything. Earl opened his eyes and stared at the blank stone. But then he would know, Earl continued. He would know that I hesitated. That 1 second of hesitation put you on that mine instead of me. He would know that his father died because his sergeant was too slow, too uncertain, too human to make a perfect decision in a moment that required perfection. And maybe he would forgive me. Maybe he would say the same things you said in that helicopter. Not your fault. But I would see it in his eyes, Teddy. The question, the doubt, the wondering if his father might still be alive if someone else had been leading that patrol. Earl's legs gave out. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold marble floor, his back against the granite, his ruined knee stretched out in front of him at an angle that would cost him tomorrow. The ceiling rose above him in the darkness, vaulted and shadowed, and indifferent to the pain of old men who carried letters they could not deliver. I do not know what to do, Earl whispered. For 53 years, I have known exactly what to do. Stay hidden. Stay quiet. Carry the weight alone, because the weight was mine to carry. But now your son is here, and Delgado knows the truth, and that cadet keeps pushing me like he's trying to break something open, and I can feel it all crumbling around me. The walls I built, the silence I maintained, all of it crumbling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. The envelope was soft as cloth in his hands, the edges worn smooth by decades of touching. For when you are old enough to understand. Teddy's handwriting. Teddy's last words to a son he would never meet. Earl held the letter against his chest and felt the tears come. He had not cried in years. Decades maybe. Crying required feeling, and feeling required acknowledging pain, and acknowledging pain required admitting that he was still alive when Teddy was not. But tonight, alone in the darkness with the weight of 53 years pressing down on him, the tears came anyway. I am tired, Teddy. Earl's voice was barely audible. So tired of running. So tired of hiding. So tired of carrying this alone. I look at your son, and I see you looking back at me, and all I want to do is tell him that you loved him, that you wrote him letters every night by flashlight, that you talked about him constantly, about the future you were building, about the father you were going to be. He deserves to know that. He deserves to know you the way I knew you. The silence of the memorial wing pressed in around him. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed midnight. 12 hours until the ceremony. 12 hours until General Theodore Vance Jr. stood in the ceremonial hall and spoke about legacy and sacrifice and the debt that could never be repaid. Earl looked down at the letter in his hands. I could walk away, he said to the empty air. I could be gone before sunrise. No one would know. No one would care. The general would give his speech and fly back to Washington and keep searching for a ghost who does not want to be found. And I would keep running, keep hiding, keep carrying this weight until it finally buries me. He pressed the letter against his chest again, feeling the crinkle of old paper, the weight of unspoken words. Or I could stay. The words hung in the darkness. Earl did not know if he had spoken them aloud or only thought them. It did not matter. The truth was the same either way. I could stay and let the truth come out. Not for me. I do not deserve recognition. I do not deserve vindication. But your son deserves answers. Your son deserves this letter. Your son deserves to know that his father was brave and kind and loved him more than anything in the world. And maybe the only way to finally honor your memory is to stop running from it. Earl struggled to his feet, his knees screaming in protest, his hand bracing against the wall for support. He stood before the blank section of granite and pressed his palm flat against the cold stone one final time. I'm going to stay, Teddy. Earl's voice was steady now, quiet but certain. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to give your son this letter, and I'm going to tell him everything. And if he hates me for what happened, if he blames me the way I have blamed myself for 53 years, then at least he will know the truth. At least he will know that someone remembered. At least he will know that his father did not die forgotten. Earl stepped back from the wall. The memorial wing stretched dark and silent around him. 12 hours until the ceremony. 12 hours until the truth. He tucked the letter back into his pocket and walked toward the maintenance closet where his supplies waited. He had floors to polish. He had a ceremony to prepare for. And for the first time in 53 years, he had a reason to stop running. The ceremonial hall gleamed like a temple prepared for sacrifice. Every brass fixture blazed with reflected light. Every marble tile shone with the kind of polish that came from hours of labor and gallons of determination. The chairs stood in perfect rows, aligned with military precision, waiting for the bodies that would fill them in less than 3 hours. Earl had worked through the night to make this happen. His knee had stopped screaming around 4 in the morning, settling into a dull roar that he had learned to ignore decades ago. Pain was just information. Information could be filed away and dealt with later. Thornton arrived at noon with an entourage of senior cadets and a clipboard thick with inspection checklists. He moved through the hall like a general surveying conquered territory, running gloved fingers across surfaces, examining corners for dust that did not exist, searching for imperfections that would justify his authority. Earl watched from near the service entrance, mop in hand, waiting for the inevitable. "You." Thornton's voice cracked across the hall like a whip. "Janitor, come here." Earl walked slowly across the marble, his limp more pronounced than usual after the long night of work. The senior cadets watched with expressions ranging from amusement to discomfort. Thornton stood near the elevated stage, his arms crossed, his face arranged in the particular expression of contempt he reserved for people he considered beneath him. "What is this?" Thornton pointed at a spot on the floor near the front row of chairs. Earl looked down. He saw nothing. The marble was immaculate. But Thornton's finger jabbed at the air insistently. "Right there. That smudge. Do you see it?" Earl studied the floor. There was no smudge. There was nothing but his own reflection staring back at him from the polished surface. But he had learned long ago that arguing with men like Thornton only made things worse. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I will clean it again. You will clean it again." Thornton laughed, and the sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Of course you will. That is what you do. That is all you do. Clean up messes made by better men. Mop floors that better men walk on. Exist in the margins while better men live actual lives." Earl lowered himself carefully to his knees, his right leg protesting violently, and began wiping at the invisible smudge with a cloth he kept in his back pocket. The marble was cold against his palms. The position sent fire racing up his thigh and into his hip, but he kept wiping, kept his eyes down, kept his breathing steady. Thornton circled him slowly. "The general arrives in 2 hours," he announced to his audience of senior cadets. "A 4-star general, a man who has commanded armies, a man whose family has served this country for 3 generations. And this is what he will see when he walks into this hall. An old cripple on his knees, cleaning floors, exactly where people like him belong." Something shifted in Earl's chest. A crack in the walls he had built. A tremor in the foundation of 53 years of silence. He kept wiping at the floor, but his jaw tightened. His hands pressed harder against the marble. "You know what I think?" Thornton crouched down until his face was level with Earl's, close enough that Earl could smell the coffee on his breath. "I think you enjoy this. I think you spent your whole worthless life failing at everything you tried, and now you have finally found your calling. Professional floor cleaner. Professional invisible man. Professional nothing." Earl's hands stopped moving. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, but something behind them had gone very still. The same stillness that Sarah Chan had noticed. The same stillness that had made Thornton step backward 2 days ago. But this time Thornton did not notice. This time Thornton was too intoxicated by his own performance to see the danger signs. "Tell me something, old man." Thornton's voice dropped to a whisper. "Did you ever amount to anything? Even once in your pathetic life? Did you ever do a single thing worth remembering?" Earl looked up. His eyes met Thornton's, and what the cadet captain saw there made the words die in his throat. There was no fear in those eyes, no submission, no broken old man accepting his place in the hierarchy. There was something ancient and cold and absolutely certain. There was something that had walked through minefields and carried dying men and made decisions that determined who lived and who died. The moment stretched. Thornton's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face had gone pale. His hands, which had been resting confidently on his knees, began to tremble. Earl said nothing. He simply held Thornton's gaze, letting the silence speak volumes that words never could. Then, slowly, deliberately, he returned his attention to the floor and resumed wiping at the invisible smudge. Thornton stood abruptly. His voice came out higher than before, stripped of its commanding authority. Finish cleaning and then disappear. I do not want to see you again until the ceremony is over. You will remain in the service corridor throughout the general's visit. If I catch you anywhere near the main hall during the ceremony, I will have you removed from the premises permanently. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Earl said. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. Thornton turned and walked away quickly, his senior cadets trailing behind him with confused expressions. Something had happened in that exchange, something they did not fully understand. The janitor had not said anything defiant, had not done anything insubordinate, but somehow the power dynamic had shifted. Somehow the old man on his knees had become the one in control. Earl remained kneeling on the cold marble until the footsteps faded. Then he slowly, painfully rose to his feet. His knee buckled slightly, but he steadied himself against a nearby chair. His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the pocket where Teddy's letter waited. 2 hours until the ceremony. 2 hours until General Theodore Vance, Jr. stood at the podium and spoke about legacy and sacrifice. 2 hours until the moment Earl had been avoiding for 53 years. Thornton wanted him to disappear. Thornton wanted him to remain invisible, hidden in the service corridor like a shameful secret. Thornton wanted the world to continue operating according to rules that valued bloodlines over sacrifice and appearance over substance. But Earl was done disappearing. Earl was done being invisible. Earl was done letting men like Thornton define the terms of his existence. He looked around the ceremonial hall one final time, taking in the polished brass and gleaming marble and perfect rows of chairs. In 2 hours, this room would be filled with people who believed they understood sacrifice. People who wore uniforms and spoke of duty and had never walked through a minefield carrying their brothers on their backs. Earl had walked through that minefield. Earl had carried those brothers. And now, finally, it was time to stop hiding from what that meant. He tucked his cleaning cloth into his pocket and walked toward the service corridor where Thornton had ordered him to stay. But as he walked, his hand remained pressed against his chest, against the letter that had waited 53 years to be delivered. 2 hours. The countdown had begun, and nothing Thornton said or did would stop what was coming. The service corridor ran parallel to the ceremonial hall, separated by a thick wall and a single door that was supposed to remain closed during official functions. Earl stood in the dim passage, listening to the sounds of the ceremony beginning on the other side, chairs scraping as dignitaries took their seats, the murmur of voices settling into respectful silence, the click of heels on marble as officers assumed their positions, and then, cutting through it all, the voice of Colonel Webb welcoming the assembled guests to Hollister Military Academy. Earl pressed his palm flat against the wall. The vibrations of the ceremony traveled through the stone like a heartbeat, distant but present, alive with the energy of 400 people gathered to honor traditions they believed they understood. His other hand rested against his chest, feeling the shape of Teddy's letter through the fabric of his uniform. The introduction of General Vance took 7 minutes. Colonel Webb recited accomplishments and commendations, deployments and decorations, the steady accumulation of excellence that had carried a fatherless boy from a small town in Ohio to the highest ranks of the United States Army. Earl listened to every word. He heard the echo of Teddy in the descriptions of courage and dedication. He heard the legacy of a man who had never lived to see it take root. Then the general began to speak. The voice was deeper than Teddy's had been, weathered by decades of command, but something in its cadence was achingly familiar. Earl closed his eyes and let the words wash over him. The general spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of the men and women who gave everything so that others could stand in polished halls and speak of legacy. He spoke of his own journey, of the father he had never known, of the questions that had driven him through 30 years of service. "I joined the army to find answers," the general said. His voice carried clearly through the wall, amplified by the hall's acoustics. "My father died in Vietnam when I was not yet born. He died in an operation so classified that his name never appeared on any memorial. For most of my life, all I had was a folded flag and dog tags that smelled like someone else's blood." Earl's hand pressed harder against the wall. His breathing had gone shallow. "But I also had stories," the general continued. "Stories from men who served with him. Stories about a sergeant they called Shepherd who led them through impossible situations and brought them home when home seemed like a fantasy. My father wrote about this sergeant in his letters to my mother. He said that Shepherd was the finest soldier he had ever known. He said that if anything happened to him, Shepherd would make sure the squad survived." The service corridor seemed to contract around Earl. The air grew thick. His heart pounded against his ribs with an intensity that made his vision blur. The general's voice dropped lower. "I have spent 30 years looking for Shepherd. 30 years searching through declassified records and interviewing aging veterans and following trails that always went cold. I wanted to thank him for bringing my father's brothers home. I wanted to ask him what my father was like in those final days. I wanted to know if my father died bravely, if he suffered, if he said anything at the end." Earl's legs buckled. He caught himself against the wall, his ruined knees screaming in protest, his eyes burning with tears he could not stop. "I never found him," the general said. "Shepherd vanished after the war. Some said he died. Some said he could not live with the guilt of losing a man. Some said he was still out there somewhere, carrying a weight that no one should carry alone. Wherever he is, if he is still alive, I want him to know something." The corridor fell silent. Earl held his breath. "I want him to know that my father's sacrifice was not in vain. I want him to know that the son Theodore Vance never grew up to become a soldier because of the example set by men like Shepherd. I want him to know that he is not forgotten, that he will never be forgotten, and that if he is carrying guilt for what happened in that minefield, he can let it go. Because 7 families got their sons back because of what he did. 7 futures were possible because one man refused to leave his brothers behind." Earl's hand found the door handle. He did not remember deciding to open it. He did not remember stepping through. But suddenly he was standing at the back of the ceremonial hall, 400 faces turned toward the stage, and only one face turning toward him. Sarah Chun sat in the 3rd row. She had been watching the general speak, moved by words she only partially understood, when movement at the service entrance caught her attention. She turned and saw the old janitor standing in the doorway. His face was wet with tears. His hand was pressed against his chest, and his eyes were fixed on the stage with an intensity that made her breath catch. She was not the only one who noticed. Sergeant Major Delgado stood near the east wall in her dress uniform. Her head turned at the sound of the door opening. Her eyes found Earl and went wide. Her hand moved to her mouth. The general continued speaking, unaware of the disruption at the back of the hall. He was describing a photograph he kept in his office. 8 young men in jungle fatigues, his father standing in the back row with a smile that would never age. But his words began to slow. Something was changing in the room. Heads were turning. Whispers were spreading. The attention that had been focused entirely on the stage was fragmenting, shifting, redirecting toward the service entrance. General Vance looked up from his notes. His eyes swept the hall, searching for the source of the disturbance. They passed over rows of cadets and officers and dignitaries. They reached the back of the room. They found Earl. The general stopped speaking. His mouth remained open, but no words came out. His eyes locked onto the old janitor standing in the doorway, taking in the pronounced limp, the weathered face, the tears streaming down lined cheeks. Taking in the hand pressed against the chest, against the place where something important was hidden. The general's own hand moved unconsciously to his chest, to the dog tags he wore beneath his uniform. His father's dog tags, the ones that had been removed from a dead man's neck in an extraction helicopter 53 years ago. The silence in the ceremonial hall was absolute. For 100 people held their breath, sensing that something was happening, something beyond their understanding, something that had been building for longer than most of them had been alive. Earl took a step forward. His knee nearly gave out, but he caught himself. His eyes never left the general's face. Teddy's face. The face of a son who had spent 30 years searching for answers. Earl's voice came out barely above a whisper, but in the perfect silence of the hall, every word carried. 34.27 degrees north. 106.83 degrees east. Guangti, Hovin, February 19th, 1971. The general's face went white. His hands gripped the podium. His voice cracked on a single word. Shepherd? The word hung in the air like a hell breath. Shepherd. 400 people sat frozen in their seats, watching something unfold that none of them fully understood. The general stood at the podium with his hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The old janitor stood at the back of the hall with tears streaming down his face and 53 years of silence crumbling around him. Earl took another step forward. His voice grew stronger, steadier, carrying across the hall with a clarity that seemed impossible for a man who had spent 11 years speaking only in whispers. Operation Prairie Fire. Extraction of indigenous assets from a compromised position. 8-man team inserted at 0400 hours. Intelligence reported the corridor was clear. Intelligence was wrong. The general's legs buckled slightly. He caught himself on the podium, his eyes never leaving Earl's face. In the front row, Colonel Webb sat with his mouth hanging open. Beside him, Thornton had gone so pale he looked like he might faint. Earl continued walking forward, each step a victory over the knee that had been destroyed in a minefield half a century ago. His voice filled the hall, not with volume, but with the weight of truth that had been buried far too long. We hit the minefield at 0630. 200 meters of unmarked ground between us and the extraction point. I made the call. Single file. My footprints only. I would walk the path first, and they would follow exactly where I stepped. Sergeant Major Delgado had begun moving along the east wall, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears running freely down her cheeks. Sarah Chun sat rigid in her seat, her eyes wide, her mind racing to connect what she was hearing with the old man she had watched being humiliated for days. Earl reached the center aisle and stopped. His hand moved to his chest, to the pocket where the letter waited. 7 trips. I made 7 trips across that minefield, carrying wounded men on my back, stepping only in my own footprints because there was no other way to know where the mines were not. Morrison, Kowalski, Hernandez, Byrne, Jackson, Gillespie, Walsh. 7 men, 7 trips. My knee took shrapnel on the 7th crossing. The joint shattered, but there was still 1 man left. Earl's voice broke. He steadied himself, drawing on reserves of strength that had carried him through jungles and decades and the long night of his own survival. Private First Class Theodore James Vance. Your father. He was still alive when I went back for him. Still breathing. Still talking. The mine had fired low, torn up his legs and his abdomen, but he was conscious. He was lucid, and he had one thing on his mind. The general's hand moved to his chest. His fingers found the shape of dog tags beneath his uniform. The dog tags that had hung around his father's neck in a jungle that no longer existed. Earl reached into his pocket and withdrew the letter. The envelope was soft and worn, yellowed with age, but the handwriting on the front was still clearly visible. For when you're old enough to understand. He wrote you a letter, Earl said, the night before we moved through that corridor. He wrote you a letter every night. But this one was different. This one he sealed. This one he made me promise to deliver if anything happened to him. The general descended from the stage. His movements were unsteady, his composure shattered, his 4 stars and 30 years of command meaning nothing in the face of what he was witnessing. He walked down the center aisle toward Earl, toward the old janitor who had carried his father through hell and then disappeared into silence. I crawled the last 50 meters, Earl continued. My knee was destroyed. I could not walk, but I would not leave him. I dragged myself through the mud with your father on my back, his arms around my neck, his blood soaking through my uniform. The extraction helicopter was waiting. The medics were ready. They did everything they could. Earl and the general stood face to face in the center of the aisle. 2 men separated by 53 years and connected by a bond that death itself could not sever. The hall had gone so silent that the sound of breathing seemed deafening. He died in the helicopter, Earl said. His voice was barely a whisper now, but every word carried. 47 minutes after extraction. He held my hand the whole time. He talked about you, about your mother, about the future he wanted for you. And in his last moments, he made me promise 2 things. The general's face was wet with tears. His voice came out broken. What did he make you promise? Earl held out the letter with trembling hands. First, he made me promise to deliver this letter to his son. I have carried it for 53 years. I was supposed to give it to your mother, but I could not face her. Could not explain why her husband died when I hesitated for 1 second before sending him down that path instead of going myself. So I ran. I hid. I convinced myself that disappearing was the same as protecting you from the truth. The general took the letter with hands that shook as badly as Earl's. He stared at his father's handwriting, at words that had waited half a century to be read. What was the second promise? He asked. Earl's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his face, and his voice cracked on every word. He made me promise to watch over you, to make sure you were okay, to be there if you ever needed anything. And I failed him. I failed him in everything except carrying his body home. I watched your career from a distance. I tracked every promotion, every commendation, every step you took. But I never reached out, never made contact, never gave you the answers you deserved. Because I was a coward. Because facing you meant facing what I did. What I failed to do. Earl's legs gave out. He collapsed his knees on the marble floor, his ruined leg twisted beneath him, his head bowed in the posture of a man finally surrendering a burden he had carried far too long. Your father's last words were about you, Earl said. He wanted you to know that he loved you before you were even born. He wanted you to know that he would have been there for everything if he could have been. He wanted you to know that dying was the only thing that could have kept him away. The general looked down at the old man kneeling before him. The janitor, the legend, the ghost who had haunted his entire life. Then he did something that made every person in the ceremonial hall catch their breath. General Theodore Vance Jr., 4-star general, deputy commander of Army Special Operations, lowered himself to his knees on the marble floor. He knelt facing Earl, their eyes level, their faces inches apart, and he reached out and pulled the old man into an embrace that 53 years of separation had been building toward. You brought him home, the general whispered. His voice was fierce, broken, absolute. You carried my father through a minefield on a shattered knee. You held his hand while he died. You kept his memory alive when the whole world forgot he existed. And you think you failed him? The general pulled back and looked into Earl's eyes. Master Sergeant Earl Westbrook, call sign Shepherd. You did not fail my father. You honored him. Every single day, for 53 years, you honored him. And now it is time for someone to honor you. The general rose to his feet and turned to face the assembled crowd. His voice rang out across the hall, stripped of ceremony, filled with something far more powerful than protocol. On your feet, every single one of you. On your feet for Master Sergeant Earl Westbrook, who saved 7 American soldiers in a minefield in Vietnam, who destroyed his knee carrying the wounded to safety, who received the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony that never officially happened, and who has spent the last 11 years cleaning the floors of this academy while cadets mocked him for the limp he earned bringing American heroes home. The hall erupted into motion. 400 people rose as one. The sound of chairs scraping against marble was thunderous. And then the applause began, and it did not stop. The applause rolled through the ceremonial hall like thunder that refused to fade. 400 people on their feet, their hands coming together in a rhythm that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Earl remained on his knees, overwhelmed, his face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. The general stood beside him, one hand resting on Earl's shoulder, anchoring him to a moment that 53 years of running had failed to prevent. Sergeant Major Delgado was the first to move. She walked down the center aisle with tears streaming down her face, her dress uniform immaculate, her bearing military perfect despite the emotion cracking her composure. She stopped 3 feet from Earl and snapped to attention. Then she rendered a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. "Master Sergeant Westbrook," she said, her voice carrying over the fading applause. "On behalf of every enlisted soldier who ever served, it is the honor of my life to salute you." Earl looked up at her. His hand trembled as he raised it to return the salute, the muscle memory of decades rising through the fog of exhaustion and emotion. "Sergeant Major," he managed, at ease. Delgado held the salute for a long moment before lowering her hand. Then she turned to face the crowd and spoke in the command voice she had perfected over 28 years. "I have served this academy for 9 years. For 9 of those years, I have watched this man work. Watched him check corners like he was clearing rooms. Watched him stand at the memorial wall every single night, touching blank stone because the names of his brothers were never allowed to be carved there. Watched him maintain a military bearing that 11 years of pushing a mop could not erase. I suspected who he was. I never asked because some men earn their silence. But today, silence ends. Today, the truth speaks." She turned back to Earl and extended her hand. "Let me help you up, Master Sergeant. You have been on your knees long enough." Earl took her hand. The general took his other arm. Together, they lifted him to his feet, supporting him as his ruined knee threatened to buckle. The applause surged again, louder than before, accompanied now by voices calling out words of respect and gratitude. "Thank you for your service. Welcome home. God bless you, Sergeant." In the third row, Sarah Chun stood with tears running down her cheeks, her hands raw from clapping. She had watched the old janitor being humiliated for days. She had sensed something wrong about his stillness, something powerful beneath the surface. Now she understood. The stillness had not been defeat. It had been discipline. The discipline of a man who had learned to contain himself in places where containment meant survival. Near the front of the hall, Colonel Webb had risen from his seat with an expression of stunned comprehension. His mind raced through every interaction with the janitor, every dismissal, every moment of casual disregard. He thought about the personnel file that listed no military service, the background check that had found nothing remarkable, the 11 years of reliable employment that had never warranted a second glance. He thought about how completely he had failed to see what was standing right in front of him. And then there was Thornton. Cadet Captain Bradley Thornton III had not risen with the rest of the crowd. He remained frozen in his seat, his face the color of ash, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The world he had constructed, the hierarchy of bloodlines and appearances and inherited excellence, was collapsing around him. The old man he had mocked, the cripple he had forced to kneel, the worthless janitor he had threatened with termination. That man was a legend. That man had done things that Thornton's grandfather and father combined had never approached. That man had earned respect that no amount of legacy or pedigree could match. The general's voice cut through the noise. He had released Earl's arm and stepped forward to address the crowd, his composure returning with the practice of decades in command. "I came to this academy to speak about legacy," he said. "I prepared remarks about duty and sacrifice and the debt we owe to those who served before us. But I find that my prepared remarks are no longer adequate. Because legacy is not about speeches. Legacy is not about ceremonies. Legacy is about men like Earl Westbrook, who carry the weight of impossible choices and keep carrying it long after the world has forgotten they exist." He turned to look at Thornton, and his gaze was not angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed. "Cadet Captain Thornton, please stand." Thornton rose on legs that barely supported him. His face had gone from pale to flushed, shame burning through him like fever. Every eye in the hall turned to watch. "I am told," the general continued, "that you have spent the past several days mocking this man, mocking his limp, mocking his appearance, demanding that he kneel to clean floors for your inspection. Is this accurate?" Thornton's mouth opened. No sound came out. He nodded, a small jerky motion that confirmed everything. The general stepped closer to him. His voice dropped, but in the silence of the hall, every word was audible. "The limp you mocked was earned in a minefield, carrying 7 wounded American soldiers to safety one at a time. The appearance you found so offensive is the result of 53 years of survivor's guilt and a level of sacrifice you cannot begin to comprehend. And the man you forced to kneel has forgotten more about leadership, duty, and honor than you may ever learn." Thornton's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair, his head dropping into his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs he could not control. The general turned back to the crowd. "I do not say this to destroy Cadet Thornton. I say this because every person in this room needs to understand something. The warriors who deserve our greatest respect do not always wear their medals on their chests. They do not always stand tall and proud in perfect uniforms. Sometimes they push mops. Sometimes they limp. Sometimes they spend decades in silence because the weight of what they carry is too heavy to share. Look around you. Look at the people you pass every day without seeing. You may be walking past a legend." He returned to Earl's side and placed both hands on the old man's shoulders. "Master Sergeant Earl Westbrook," he said, "call sign Shepherd. I have waited my entire life to say these words to you. On behalf of my father, Private First Class Theodore James Vance, who loved you like a brother. On behalf of my mother, who died 6 years ago still wondering what happened in that jungle. On behalf of myself, the son who grew up fatherless because war demands prices that cannot be calculated. Thank you. Thank you for carrying my father home. Thank you for holding his hand while he died. Thank you for keeping his memory alive when the whole world forgot." The general's voice cracked on the final words. He pulled Earl into another embrace. And this time Earl embraced him back, his arms wrapping around the son of the man he had carried through a minefield, the son he had watched from the shadows for 53 years, the son who had finally found the ghost he had been chasing. The hall erupted into applause again, but this time it was different. This time there were tears mixed with the clapping, voices calling out blessings and gratitude, for 100 people witnessing a moment of grace that none of them would ever forget. And in the center of it all, an old janitor with a ruined knee held onto a 4-star general and wept for a friend who had died 53 years ago in a helicopter over a jungle that no longer existed. "Still here, Teddy," Earl whispered into the general's shoulder. "I kept my promise. Your boy found me, and he turned out better than either of us could have dreamed." 3 months later, the memorial wall in the north wing of Hollister Military Academy looked different. A new plaque had been installed on the section of blank granite where Earl had pressed his palm every night for 11 years. The plaque was small, bronze, officially unauthorized, but permanently tolerated. It read, "Private First Class Theodore James Vance. Operation Prairie Fire. February 19th, 1971. Beloved husband, father, and brother in arms. Never forgotten." Earl stood before the plaque in the early morning light, his hand resting against the cool metal, his lips moving in the silent conversation he had maintained for 53 years. But the conversation was different now. The weight was different. The words came easier. "Your boy read the letter," Earl said softly. "Read it 6 times that first night. Called me at 2 in the morning because he could not sleep. Wanted to know everything. Every story. Every memory. Every detail about who you were before the world took you away. We talked until sunrise. First of many conversations. He has your laugh, Teddy. I never knew that until I heard it. Same laugh. Same way your eyes crinkle up at the corners. Your wife must have seen it every time she looked at him. Must have broken her heart and healed it at the same time." Footsteps approached from behind. Earl did not turn. He had learned to recognize those footsteps over the past 3 months, the confident stride of a man who had spent 30 years in command learning to walk with purpose. General Theodore Vance, Jr. stopped beside Earl and looked at the plaque bearing his father's name. He wore civilian clothes today, jeans, and a button-down shirt, the 4 stars left behind in Washington along with the formality they demanded. He visited when he could, more often than duty should have allowed. Something about making up for lost time. "I brought you something," the general said. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Earl looked at it with confusion. "Open it." Earl took the box with trembling hands. Inside, resting on a bed of white satin, was a purple heart. The ribbon was crisp and new, but the metal itself carried the weight of recognition long overdue. "I made some calls," the general said. "Pulled some strings. The official records may have burned, but testimony matters. Delgado's research. Statements from the surviving members of your squad. A very strongly worded letter from a 4-star general demanding that the Army correct a 53-year oversight." He smiled. "They expedited the paperwork. This belongs to you. Should have belonged to you a long time ago." Earl stared at the medal. His vision blurred. He had never wanted recognition, had spent 5 decades running from the very possibility of it. But holding this small piece of metal in his hands, feeling the weight of official acknowledgement, something released in his chest that he had not known was still holding on. "Thank you," he whispered, "but this is not why I stayed." "I know." The general's hand found Earl's shoulder. "You stayed because my father asked you to watch over me. You stayed because you made a promise. And you kept that promise in ways neither of us understood until now." They stood together in silence. 2 men connected by blood that was not blood, by brotherhood that transcended biology, by a love that had survived death in decades, and the long silence of survivor's guilt. The academy had changed in 3 months. Earl no longer pushed him up. His official title was now Special Advisor to First-Year Cadets, a position created specifically for him, funded by an anonymous donation that everyone knew came from Washington. His office was small, tucked into a corner of the administrative building, but cadets found their way there at all hours. The ones who were struggling, the ones who felt like they did not belong, the ones who needed to hear that excellence was not inherited, that courage was not born, that the greatest warriors were often the ones who looked most broken. Thornton had visited that office once, 3 weeks after the ceremony. He had stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to speak, his face carrying the weight of shame that had not yet transformed into something useful. Earl had simply gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited. They talked for 4 hours. Thornton wept. He apologized. He confessed that his entire identity had been built on a foundation of assumptions that the ceremony had shattered. He did not know who he was anymore, did not know what he believed, did not know how to move forward when everything he thought he understood about honor and legacy and worth had been proven wrong. Earl listened. He did not offer absolution. Absolution was not his to give. But he offered something else. He offered the truth about his own failures. The hesitation that had cost Teddy his life. The decades of running. The cowardice disguised as penance. He showed Thornton that broken men could still serve, that mistakes did not have to define a life, that redemption was a process rather than a destination. Thornton was now volunteering at a veterans assistance program in the city. He spent his weekends talking to homeless veterans, listening to their stories, learning to see the humanity he had been trained to overlook. It was a beginning, only a beginning, but beginnings mattered. The morning light strengthened around the memorial wall. Earl removed his hand from the plaque and turned to face the general. "I have something for you too," Earl said. He reached into his pocket and withdrew Teddy's dog tags, the ones he had carried for 53 years, the ones that still bore traces of blood in the grooves that no amount of cleaning could remove. "These belong to you now," Earl said. "I kept them safe, kept them close, but your father wanted you to have them, wanted you to know that he was thinking of you in those last moments, that you were the last thing on his mind before he slipped away." The general took the dog tags with reverent hands. He held them up to the light, reading the letters and numbers that spelled out his father's identity, touching metal that his father had worn against his skin in the final days of his life. "Will you tell me about him?" the general asked. His voice was rough with emotion. Not the soldier. I have heard about the soldier. Tell me about the man. Tell me about my father. Earl smiled. It was a real smile, the first one that had come easily in decades. He had a laugh that could fill a room. He sang off-key when he thought no one was listening. He wrote your mother letters that would make poets jealous. He believed in goodness even when evidence suggested otherwise. And he loved you, Theodore. He loved you more than he loved his own life. I know that because he proved it. The last thing he did on this earth was make sure his brothers got home, so that somewhere, a baby he had never met would grow up in a world worth living in. The general wiped his eyes. His hand closed around the dog tags, holding them against his chest the way Earl had held them for 53 years. Thank you, he said, for everything, for carrying him home, for keeping his memory alive, for finally letting me find you. Earl looked back at the plaque on the wall, at the name that was finally carved in a place where others could see it. You found me, Earl said softly. All those years, I thought I was watching over you from the shadows. And it turns out you were the one who brought me home. Your father will be proud, Theodore. So proud of the man you became. So proud of the son who never stopped searching. The two men stood together as the morning light filled the memorial wing, as cadets began to move through distant corridors, as another day at Hollister Military Academy began with lessons about duty and honor and sacrifice. But the most important lessons were not taught in classrooms. The most important lessons were taught by old men with limps and young generals with their father's eyes, standing together before a wall of names that finally included the one that mattered most. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in disguises we might never recognize, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street carries a story. Some of those stories are legendary. Some of those people are waiting to be seen. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering that courage does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it pushes a mop. Sometimes it limps. And sometimes it waits 53 years just to finally come home. Still here, Teddy. Still keeping the promise. But I'm not doing it alone anymore.